What's up, guys? My name is Casey, and this is eBay Miniature Rescues. This week, I'm going to paint the best looking Stormcast model ever made. After the last few weeks of working on a much larger model, I decided it was time for a bit of a palette cleanser. I have a shelf in my closet that is purely dedicated to displaying models that have potential to be on this channel. Matt G was kind enough to send me a box of partially painted Stormcast models to use for the channel. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Sigmarines, and this model in particular, honestly, it's one of the coolest, if not the absolute best Sigmarine that GW has released. The way that she's standing, how intense her face is, the way that she's holding her weapon over her head like she doesn't even care what's coming for her, it's just so good. So let's jump over to the table and start working on this model. I start by scraping the mold lines with a hobby knife. There aren't too many, but one in particular across the hair was a little bit annoying to get to while the head was glued on. Then I move on to filling the gaps with Milliput. The process is pretty easy. You mix equal amounts of each compound, and then you put a little bit into any gaps in the model. I like to get a little bit of water on the putty and smooth it out. After the Milliput dries, which takes about 4 hours or so, I prime the model using Stynylrez Black Primer. There was already a little bit of primer on this particular model. Some of the gold plastic was still showing in the deeper recesses, so I tried to give it an even, fairly thin coat, just to get coverage on the entire model. Going into this project, I wanted to explore a few different ideas. The first is that I would try and go with the flow, so to speak. And what I mean by that is I didn't want to worry about color selection, planning, or trying to do something crazy with this model, just for the sake of this is a channel that I do things on. I just wanted to grab some colors and see where that would take me. After priming with black, I reached for Stynylrez Blue-Gray. My thought behind this was that Stormcast are generally gold and blue, so I thought this would make for a nice step up from that black. Again, just seeing where that would take me. Turns out this is a pretty nice color, so I decided to use this as my base coat for blue for the model. It's a little bit pulled back, not quite as saturated as regular Stormcast blue tends to be, and I really felt like it fit with this model. Deciding to highlight that blue, I went for another primer in Badger Stynylrez White. Normally I would opt for an ink, but these Badger primers go down really well through the airbrush. I didn't want too much of a dramatic shift from the blue, so I decided to highlight the tips of the cloak, and a little bit above center on the body. That way there was more interest in the cloak, and the highlight on the front would bring your attention up towards the face of the model. Okay, so now that the largest part of the model has its base coat, I'm going to start filling in the rest of the pieces with some flesh tone for the face. Now, I really like Rhinox hide for base coating leather, and since I had it on my palette, I decided to fill in anything that was going to end up being brown. There are several things we can do later on to differentiate this base coat, so I'm not too worried that all of these pieces, including the hair, are the same base brown. While that paint is drying, I'm going to grab some rust gray and a little bit of white from my wet palette. That way I can get a nice highlight color for the cloak. This will be the first pass for highlights. mainly edge highlighting, and eventually we will start to put some texture in the cloak so that it looks more like fabric. Next up is Vallejo Metal Color Copper. I've been going back and forth on this color choice for the armor, but in the spirit of going with the flow, I'm just going to grab a color I like. While I want this model to be relatively clean, I always like to do weathering when I can. So I think this will be a good base for some old metals. I'm also going to use Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum to fill in the rest of the metallic parts, mainly the weapon and the necklace. To offset some of the other colors, I decided to grab Scale 75's Indian Shadow. Normally, I would use this as shading for skin, but this color is a desaturated purplish pink, and it seemed like a good fit for the underside of the cloth bits. While that was drying, I came in with some burnt umber ink to darken down some of the copper color. With Gorthor Brown and some of that Indian Shadow mixed in, I went ahead and highlighted the leather on the gloves and belt. The lighter brown was a naturally good highlight for the leather, but adding some of this Indian Shadow gave the leather a little bit more warmth, and it tied those pieces in with the underside of the cloak on the front of the model. A lot of that color will be covered up later when I do some texturing on the leather, but there's enough of it showing that it really sets the leather gloves and belt apart from specifically the hair, which was base coated using the same brown. When texturing leather, I personally like to use skin tones. They make a good highlight and often aren't too opaque that they overwhelm the brown. So it blends nicely and they give you a good amount of control over how much texture you want to actually show up. So I decided that the armor was still a little too bright. So mixing the copper with a little bit of that rhinox hide made for a really good shading color. Even adding this color, I'm still thinking it's a little too bright. So we'll have to come back to this in a little bit and start to remedy that. Coming in with a really watered down Vallejo white, I add some texture to all of the raised edges on the cloak. Anywhere the white highlights start, I'm going to go over it a few times and intensify those highlights. And moving down towards the bottom of the cloak, I'll just use tiny little lines across the edge to create some texture. After going over the entire cloak, it definitely reads a lot more like cloth than shiny plastic. With Agrax Earthshade, I'm going to go over all of the armor one more time and darken it down. Using this shade will also matte the finish a little bit and push the color a little bit more into the background. This is definitely more of where I want to end up for that old armor, that old looking armor. Not super shiny, a little dirty and weathered. There still might be a little bit more that we can do with that, but we'll get to that later. A quick coat of Reikland Flesh Shade over the face will give some nice shadow to the skin, as well as warm up her face a little bit. Okay. So I couldn't wait too long to get back to the armor. And we need that wash to dry before we get back to highlighting the skin. So I'm going to bring in some Nihilic Oxide to put the final weathering touches on this metal. I really like to water down this paint and lay down a good coat over each area. Then using either my finger or a cleaned out brush, wipe away any excess from the surfaces. That way the oxide stays in the recesses and I can slowly layer it up and build it up onto the surfaces if I feel like there needs to be a little more in a specific area. Watering down this paint will do a few things. First, it will let the paint flow into those recesses, giving you a more natural look for this effect. And second, it dries way more transparent. So the effect is a little more subtle, and if you want it stronger, you just have to do a second or third or however many you like passes. Using Scale 75's light skin and pale skin, I'm going to highlight her face. For the most part, I'm going to hit all of the raised areas with the light skin and leave that flesh shade in any of the recesses. That way the face has an even and shaded tone. Then with the pale skin, I just want to hit all the main highlight points like cheeks, her nose, the brow line, in order to give a little more form and show her expression. I purposely avoided the areas on either side of her head, where the hair is shaved down. That way we get that stubble look without having to paint that in. I also put in a highlight right at the hairline to separate that stubble, and make it look a little more purposeful. Straight from the bottle, aluminum will be the final highlight for the metallics. I want to edge highlight all of it so it frames it nicely and brings just a little bit of that shine back in. Normally, I try and plan out my models. I usually do some research to see what's out there for any given model, and I write down the colors that I plan on using. This time, I just wanted to sit down and paint, more for the fun of it than anything. Sometimes, and historically on this channel, that doesn't always work out for me, but this time it just felt right. And I was able to kind of get into the flow of the model and just make snap decisions for color and placement, not really worrying about what would happen in the end. This is something that I feel like everyone should try from time to time. If you're stuck into a large project or you've been grinding through a model for a while, just pick up a model that makes you happy when you look at it and just go for it. Don't think about it, don't plan it out. Just grab a handful of paints and start laying that down on the model and see where it takes you. I think you may be surprised at what you end up with. Thank you again to Matt G for donating these models. If you would like to donate a model to the cause, head over to ebayminiaturerescues.com and check out the donations page. I'll have a link to it down in the description. Thank you again for joining me on another eBay Miniature Rescue. If you like something about this video, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe if you'd like to see more rescues each week, and hit that bell so you know when new videos go up. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. Oh yeah, we just got new shirts. Pretty cool. If you can read it, I think you can read it.